fascinating talks, and have brought in some very different ideas, disruptions, to maybe some of the established ideas we have. And thank you to Karen for very neatly bringing us right back to the beginning. That was very good. I've been very impressed. Yes, we didn't talk about it beforehand, but it was very good. I mean, some of the things that occurred to me when you were all speaking was, as I said, some of the things about disruption. So the idea that values matter, that actually money may not have that value that we might be putting on it. The babble is intended as a disruption, and I think that, so there's a sort of interesting thing there about the importance of disruptions into trying to take us into somewhere different, which is, I think, what we're all trying to think about. I think there was some very interesting points that came out about tensions, and the tensions in yours between the tensions in the national and the local, and I think there's the tensions coming out through all of them. And then the thing about the importance of capacity, but what actually does capacity mean? Capacity isn't just money, capacity is a sort of an idea of continuous support. So I think there's lots of fascinating stuff that came out. So I hand over to the audience for questions, and I think maybe I'll take 3 at a time and then back, yeah? So, okay, so 1, 2, is there another person at the moment? 3? Okay, so 1, 2, 3 to start, and then I'll have another round. Yeah.
Okay. I have a question for Rebecca. 2 questions actually. You mentioned you were recording gas and electricity every second, and I thought, one, why would you do that? And are you really using that level of data? That's first. Second, you spoke about values. Did you ever think of looking at health implications of some of these strategies? Like you mentioned, you were in a house which was very cold and that had TVs on the roof. That's very common in many communities.
Can I take 3 questions?
Sure.
Yes. Roman.
It was also, Rebecca, it was very interesting the implications you drew out, but the fact remains that huge majorities of the people you said were driven by money. So, to what extent did you get any sense of whether the groups were right about thinking that appealing directly to climate change would alienate people? Because if that was the case, then you're sort of stuck. Then it may well be that the environmentally motivated behaviour works much better, but if the majority of people would be put off by that appeal, you're stuck. It's a bit depressing. And can I just say a comment? The babble thing, I don't know if this was intended, but it seemed to me like a metaphor for what, the intense barrage of information for the confused consumer on the end of all these energy interventions actually experiences.
Yeah, mine's a question also for Rebecca.
That's what I missed it down.
You presented actually, it was at a conference in London earlier this year, like Early Careers Research Conference. Yeah, you presented on something different, but I think you mentioned this sort of stuff. So yeah, really interesting presentation and great to hear you talk about it. I guess it's kind of a comment and a question. It kind of follows on from the last one. One is that you do tend to find that low-income communities tend to use less energy than more affluent ones, and so and that's generally, well, we kind of found that is because people can't afford to use too much, so they don't. So money is kind of, it does have some impact, but yeah, I take it that it might be limited. And that, I guess my other point is, we kind of resonate as well, is because the person in our study, that it's more anecdotal than what you found, but the person that uses least energy in our study is the one that you might consider to have the strongest kind of environmental values, is like kind of a typical rural. It's a very minimalistic life in many ways, but there's this kind of difference between money as a motivator and money as a measure, right? So what I mean is even though he's motivated very much by climate change, he would still kind of measure how much he's using in terms of money, if you know what I mean. So he's like, my energy bill only costs £100 a year, or whatever, this measure saved me this much. So, I just wondered if there's kind of that subtle difference there between money as motivator and money as a measure. I wondered if you had any comments on that. And also, that could still be problematic because, by using money as a measure, even if we're not saying it's a motivator, is that kind of sort of I don't know, making it become a motivator. You're kind of framing it in that way, so that's how people start to see it. So yeah, I just wondered if you had thoughts on that, really.
Okay, starting with the, I wasn't involved at the beginning of the project with the engineers, but when the amount of data we've got is a nightmare, basically. The amount we've collected, I don't know how much they thought it through for, but it's been an absolutely huge task to actually do anything with our data. We've had to build 2 separate databases and stuff because we've just had so much information. So there's that. And the other with health, that's not something I've looked at, but I think it's a really good point, and I think it's an interesting area to explore how these things relate to each other. Because that wasn't the only house that I went to with people that had they were living in extremely cold conditions. But no, that is something we'll look into. Second one, I agree. I think it's really difficult because so many people said they were motivated by money, and so many groups did frame things in terms of money. And I think there is this problem that I'm talking about. Lots of people start to talk about climate change. People switch off. It's not something a lot of people are wanting to or comfortable to engage with. So it is, I wish I had a solution, but it is a difficulty and I'm not sure how you get around that. So I hope it's not too depressing, but I don't think there is an easy answer. And stuff like the Common Cause, of course, and other work would say that there needs to be a wider cultural shift. And it's only if you did it as a bigger level where things are kind of reframed and kind of discussed in a different way, at a big cultural level, then you can start to get a shift. But kind of in terms of individuals talking to each other in groups, I think they've got to be part of it. But I can see why, even in our own, because we work with a community group there, the project, and even we find ourselves talking about doing things in terms of saving money. It just seems like the most natural way to try and engage people. It's very, very hard to not do and escape from. But it does seem to have this relationship with what people do. And
there's a motivator and measure aspect.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really interesting distinction between it being a motivation and a measure. Because everybody I spoke to doing the interviews, I think practically everybody did measure their energy use in terms of how much money it cost them. But I think that comes back to the idea of energy being visible, and how do we visualise energy and make it tangible. And money is, we all have to pay for it. So I think it's not surprising people do it like that. And if that's a problem in terms of how to aim, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure how you would get away from it, because it does have a cost for everyone. I hope that answered.
Did either of you want to add anything to this? No?
I think the thing around values is really interesting. We've done another project with Look at Values, and we should really have a chat as well. And one of the things that we found is quite important, and it actually relates to how do you motivate people to make changes, or at least engage in talking about change. One of the things we found that's quite important is something called body language, and it's in relation to sort of key political figures. That they not only do they say what they want and want us to do, but they actually do it themselves, and people, by seeing it, will then hopefully take it on board themselves. And some of our participants from this sort of project will talk about things like on Coronation Street or EastEnders. Let's not have an energy saving storyline. Let's just see people engaged in energy saving practices that then become the norm. So, it's like, values are so powerful because they underlie so many things, preferences and so on and so forth. But there are other things that you sort of can connect with, sort of, take those forward, I guess.
So there was a question at the back. Oh, there's lots of questions. Okay. Yours has been answered. Okay. You definitely get to answer one, Mike. So I'll take these two. Yeah?
I've been to Narmes, and I think it's an interesting project. I think, and what I find interesting about this sort of eco-village, the fact that it just happens in Wales, and England's just not interested. They're not interested in lots of things. underlying class thing going on. You know, it's like if you're upper class and you can buy lots of land and have your farm or whatever, that's fine. But when you have people who are deemed as either working class or even the underclass or whatever, these stereotypes that are being bandied about, it seems to be it's so much more difficult for these people to establish these communities. And if you, I mean, it's only like 400 years ago, before we had the massive enclosures, that people were actually living that way anyway, in accessing common land. I just, it seems like it's like there's this threat that actually people might actually start wanting the land back that they stole in the first place, because that is basically what happened. You know, millions of acres just got enclosed. But it is like the stipulations that are put on these communities. I mean, I just find it unbelievable that they think that it's okay to say that being after visiting the community and seeing how very varied different each individual project is in terms of it trying to gain 75% thing. But to put everyone together in that one thing to me just seems insane. You know, to expect each group to have to rely on each other. I mean, if you've been there, every project is very different. Only what they're trying to produce, what their business or model is, all this sort of thing. And there's a lot of tension within the community. People are saying that there's a lot of different ideological views. And that seems to be, rather than promoting this sort of project, which I think is a really good project, it seems to be making it a lot more difficult for them to succeed. That was my impression that I got. It was like, you know, the framework which they were existing under, you know, was really quite, it was a really strict framework in terms of like just car, like they were talking about car use. You know, we can only go down to 10.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think it does seem like there's a class thing going off. I mean, obviously not everybody can invest £35,000 to £40,000 on a plot of land, then have the money together to actually build what they're building and do what they're doing. I think, so in that sense is yes, but not, I mean, whilst you might characterise some of the people involved as being from a middle class background, they're not all that way. Some people have invested everything they absolutely have. So forth. I think in terms of the 75%, I guess what I didn't do very well at the end is when we were talking about how we can support these sorts of communities and going beyond just what money you give them, one of the ways that LAMAS could be supported is by not rigidly sticking to the 75% target. What strikes me as very sensible is rather than leaving them for 5 years and then going, so have you done it, which they're not strictly speaking done, but is sort of renegotiating targets, perhaps to individual plot holders, depending on what they're able to do and what they're able to put forward. Because there is an awful lot of pressure placed on these people. They don't have a lot. Some people are living on budgets so minute it's ridiculous. So that strikes me as one important way we could support those sorts of initiatives. In terms of sort of wider appeal and going beyond sort of this class idea, I guess, which I don't think is strictly true of LAMAS anyway. Of course, I've just forgotten what I was about to say. Oh yeah, some of the people that were involved in LAMAS got involved because they wanted to develop ways of doing that could have broader appeal to people who did not have a lot. So initially LAMAS had an element to it where there was going to be a terrace, and some of the people involved in the terrace project were specifically passionate about that project, not because they wanted to live in close proximity to their neighbours, but because they wanted to see if they could develop something that could then be emulated in other settings, be it urban or whoever. So I think, you know, there's a lot going off at LAMAS, there's a lot of aims and objectives, there are a lot of ingenious people coming together and got lots of different ideas. Like sometimes these things work, sometimes they don't. But the crucial point is they've been given that space to apply their ideas and think through their ideas and change and be dynamic, which is the good thing about the policy. What we need to now do is sort of open those sorts of regulatory measures out so they're not sort of just doggedly sticking to those sorts of targets, so that they do take into account building regs. One of the key things Lammas have struggled with is the building inspectors have come out and they don't even know how to measure what they've done. So, you know, which strikes me is we need change, and policy needs to catch up with community, and that's again what was talked about this morning, in that communities like this are working at different temporal scales than the policies themselves, and we need to sort of think about that and that juxtaposition.
Brilliant, thank you. Bridget, Mike, and at the back. Bridget.
Thanks. I was a bit horrified by the idea that people were saying that they would be monks and they're not prepared to wear a hair shirt. That was the analogy that was given from the national side. Do you think that is the way to change that specifically around getting framing the right messages around reducing energy use, or is it actually a bigger issue that people just aren't prepared to give up? You know, if it hadn't been about energy, it had been about watering the flowers at the end of the street, or if it had been about showing up babysitting duties or something. Do you think it's a climate issue, or is it that we've got to run the right things on energy that people don't feel like they must do something selfish? Sorry, that's a bit of a
Mark, I've worked in planning for 5 years, so I'll make an observation on the Lammas. Is that the first thing I look at there is that once you get a planning consent, that's the best thing to have, because you have in which that next 5 years in which to reapply or vary the conditions on the consent or reapply for something more appropriate. The first thing is to get something so you can actually start. So, and you've got that point. But my question was that given that Lammas residents will actually live a resource-efficient lifestyle, what do you believe that they will have to teach us over the next 5 to 10 years, and will we want to listen?
There's a question at the back, yes?
Yes. And I also want to start when I say with an excuse. I'm a very technical person, so what I'm going to ask might sound a bit naive. So we have heard a lot about the importance of understanding people's motivations and perceptions and norms to understand how energy efficiency is being driven. But the presentations, they were focusing on presenting the results of the qualitative analysis. I'd like to know what sort of psychological or sociological frameworks are most useful to drive that analysis. What's conceptually most useful to apply and to understand why people behave in a certain way. I guess from those domains, from sociology and psychology, there must exist frameworks that are useful. Even though maybe these others study the relationship between people and other people, and here we study the relationship between people and things, those energy-consuming things. Still, it is still there must be something about perceptions and norms that can be informed from sociology and psychology.
Or elsewhere. Bill, can I get...
This is dozing off here. Yeah, I mean, I'm feeling a little cowed in answer in front of my colleague Alex, who could probably say a bit, but we've been quite influenced by stuff from science technology studies. So some of the people I talked about, Bruno Latour, in particular, talks about ways that I kind of went through it, ways that issues emerge often through the kind of artifacts and technologies that we bring, and the way that we work with those technologies will shape the way those issues are thought about and conceived and the way we orient towards them. And I think that's been a really useful perspective for us. So in part, that underlies some of the way you might think about whether you cast energy consumption in terms of kilowatts or money or something else. That all of those will have real performative impact on, not just on understandability, but on the entire conception of what the issue is. And that's kind of a beginning of thinking towards that.
Okay. Who wants to go next?
I'm not an expert in this sort of theoretical line at all, but I think our project has been heavily influenced also by socio-technical aspects, recognising that it's not just the technical, it's the social and it's the interface between the two. Also practice theory, so in some senses, it's not, I don't prescribe to the whole argument that's going on between practice theorists and behaviour change people. I don't think it's either or, I think both illuminate different aspects. But given that such a core element to what we're thinking about is the temporal view, practice theory sits better with us because it extends the temporalities that you're dealing with. But then I don't think there's any one thing, because I think there are frames, theories and frameworks and heuristics and all those sorts of things actually play a part in our understanding of the relationships people create and how their practices generate. And I mean, that what I showed you today is one tiny aspect of the analysis we're undertaking. So there will be a lot of conceptual work to be done to understand exactly energy behaviours, energy habits and practices and so on and so forth, and how they might change. So maybe if you come back to me in a year, I'll have a better answer. Sorry.
Okay.
Well, kind of the same as Karen. Practice theory is something that we definitely we draw from. We find very useful. But I think it's the same thing. I think there is a divide between practice theory and behaviour change stuff, but I think it's drawing from as wide a canvas as you can to make sense of the data you've got. But I think what practice theory does, which is quite nice, is it does help to get away from the focus on the individual, so with a more psychological side of it, where you're just looking at the individual almost in isolation from anything else, and it puts people back into wider social structures and cultural assumptions and norms and stuff like that, so it helps to kind of keep a bigger picture of things, I think, which is what we find particularly useful.
Now everybody has sidestepped Mark's question. Maybe it's too difficult, in which case maybe we should put it on the board for discussion with everybody. Sorry? And Bridget, yes.
And can you remind me of it? Sorry.
It's just interested in your thoughts on whether it's about changing energy behaviour or general attitudes.
I think maybe one of what I hope to get across in the papers is that these things need to be linked. You can't just, I think by just focusing on energy saving in itself without linking it to anything else, I think that's possibly just not the best use of kind of people's energy. It needs to be situated, especially if people, I think, it needs to make sense. It needs to be situated in their local. So I think about babysitting and auto and things like that, I think it needs to be part of kind of every people's everyday lives, so it makes more sense to them, as well as being linked to kind of wider issues like climate change and energy scarcity and the rest of it. So,
Can I just say, I think one of the things that tickles me about the Babel in a way is that it takes this it insists upon talking about energy, or it tries to insist on talking about energy as a chief topic all the time, but it won't. And it won't either by accident or because people will input stuff that's not about energy. So it also plays with this issue of where our attention needs to be in some ways.
I'm going to give a stab at your question. I'm probably going to fail abysmally at answering it adequately. I think they will have a lot to teach us, which isn't my full answer. I think they're going through a tremendous amount of change and difficulties and struggles and also achievements. I think they're a very compelling bunch of people because they are so ordinary in some senses, although arguably they're doing an extraordinary thing. I think the amount of exposure they currently have, the fact that they are engaging people in multiple different ways, sort of shows that people are interested in what they're doing. Not necessarily that they will then go away and do it themselves, but they're at least engaged in what others are doing. So a sort of a pat answer in a way. To the second part, will we listen? Well, I think yes. I mean, I think we're all open to what they're doing and why they're doing it. I think, it comes back to what I've sort of already said. Will we actually then take on board the lessons and actually do it ourselves is another question. I would just like to say, though, in terms of the planning consent, and that obviously it gave them a framework and then they could reapply and make changes in the course, that sounds very simplistic and unproblematic. the actual amount of time and effort it's taking them to re-get planning consent when they have wanted to make changes actually not being simple. And I think that's one of the key things with Lammas is that 75% target is driving a lot of things, so much so that some people aren't yet building their permanent homes. You know, so that is framing everything they do and putting a constraint or an added hurdle of difficulty. That being said, obviously, like you pointed out, it is a tremendous opportunity as well. So I'm not dismissing that, and it's not all doom and gloom.
I have one last question for T.
Okay, thanks. Right, we're trying to bridge them all. It's about the babble around the values we have and sense of community, okay? So I run workshops called Make Your Home Eco. I'm doing a couple of sessions in the College Green over the weekend, just activities. But usually, in a short course, I ask people what their motivations are, and they're incredibly wide. Because someone wants to be able to survive everything breaking down, someone wants to deal with climate change, someone wants a warm house, someone wants to look after the features of a lovely traditional house because that's where they like to live. Someone wants low bills, you know. Someone wants to be renewable, and they would do completely different things. The people who wanted a zero bill house would put vast amounts of capital in order not to have bills in the future. So it would be a different solution. And to get onto the babble, you have to demystify this, and that's why I put together a course to try to demystify home energy issues, because they're so bloody confusing, and no one's actually trying to help us understand. Typically, they're trying to sell us whatever current scheme there is, like got to change your light bulbs or do your wall, or get a Green Deal assessment and then do what's cost effective and remember what the golden rule means, you know, which is totally confusing anyway, for most people, including ones trying to implement it. Or manage it. Now, but in terms of a sense of community, we probably don't have a community because of our energy issues, but it's interesting. What I'm wondering about the community is they don't actually have to go to a meeting or take part, but they're collectively bound. I mean, that's quite interesting, really, for a community that has a collective obligation. The nearest thing to one in Bristol, the Self-Built community, was a set of private developments that could be sold without reference to all the people in the rest of the self-built development, which was, again, quite interesting. They chose a model that didn't engage them. So, I don't know how these turn into a question, but there's something about what is it, you know, what do we mean by community if you don't actually have to be part of it?
We could let that one hang over to the next session, unless you want to say anything in particular.
Community energy grant panel, and every 3 months we tried to discuss what a community was, because we kept having applications from people who might or might not have been a community, but we had to give grants to them. You know.
I mean, I think to be fair to Lammas, I mean, okay, that they were deliberately, in some senses, for some of the people, trying to get away from being seen as a commune. They wanted some independence, but that's not to say that they don't get together and have meetings and contribute. So, you know, I've probably slightly misrepresented what exactly goes off on that site. I mean, of course, there's a difference between formal meetings and informal collaborations as well. So a lot of things will happen, as we do in all walks of life. You're walking down the corridor at work and you see somebody and you have a conversation. So there's a lot of that informal exchange going off all of the time. So, you know, I don't think they would, although community wasn't an explicit part of that vision of Lammas in terms of the writing down, I don't think, you know, it was completely absent as well. And I think they've done a lot of work, coincidental work in some ways, and happenstance work to actually bring community into it, because I think it'd be impossible to do what they're doing without it. So yeah, I don't think that answered anywhere close to what you were asking, but yeah. You want to have a go at anything?
Oh, sure. I mean, what you say about the confused motivations, or not confused, the different motivations of people and the different orientations was very much one of the things that fed into the design of the Babel. And we're kind of variously trying to bridge them, but also just expose them and make them a topic, and even expose them for laughter almost, you know, for slightly standing back. And in some ways it would be nice to, I mean, there's a couple of points. One is it would be nice if that maybe encouraged people to rise above the differences in some sense, to realize that there's a lot of noise in the details, and that sometimes the there's a kind of simpler picture to be sought after in a way. And related to that in a way, in some ways, is that we hope that the Babel, in a problematic or controversial way, I would assert that by creating the Babel and distributing it amongst these groups, we are trying to form a community amongst those communities that will be formed, potentially by and through the Babel and by the collective ownership of the Babel. And that may not be a very strong community, it may even be a community of dislike towards the system, but a community nonetheless. And I think that's an interesting thing to at least think about.
I'm going to duck out.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Yeah.
I promise I'll be quick. It's interesting that all the talk about motivations, because in a sense there's a little bit of a concern. Do we need one motivation that we all subscribe to? I think what the presentations have shown today, and what we all know through our own lives, is that you don't need one motivation. It doesn't matter. If it's for climate change, if it's for money, why does that matter? As long as we're doing what we need to do. So in some sense, I think that's possibly, and I'm going to be a little bit controversial now, one of the issues with the preoccupation with deciding whether or not climate change matters, or whether people are sceptical about it. In some senses, you can park that argument and move on to, what do we do actually independent of that, and we can move forward without actually answering those questions.
Right, thank you. Well, can I thank the three speakers again, and then we'll go for tea and come back at 4:30 for a general discussion. So thank you very much.